All right, so we are live. Welcome again to the third session of the Technology for Project Management web series from GlobalGiving. And my name is Mark Maxmeister. I'm your host. I also wrote a short book about Slack for project management and shared it with you earlier. This is a longer version of some of the things in that book. And this week, we will go over a bit more of the ideas behind knowledge management and how they intersect with project management, and some other ideas that are related to that within here, including how you think about learning as a learning organization, thinking about the difference between interoperability and versus standards, and what you're really after. And I want to demonstrate some of the things that are now possible with algorithms, because you probably haven't seen just how powerful they got in the last few years. And they're so powerful that this is a point of inflection where we should be moving away from the way that project management was done and thinking and embracing a new way of drastically reducing the time and complexity and number of people that it takes to do the same things. And then I'll go through some real examples from others on how they approach this stuff. So if you have questions, you can put them in the chat box and I'll stop periodically to field them. So starting off, this is one consultant's view of what project management is about. And I found it useful compared to many others I reviewed for this, because there's a lot of people out there that have different ideas about what knowledge management is. And in this case, you would break up all of the work and all of the information flows that you have in an organization into 4 quadrants. And the one that we often think of as project management is the lower right, active facilitation role. So this is about what can you do to improve the knowledge and the learning of your organization. You could think about workflows. You could think about how the different steps in a process actually get recorded, and is the recorded copy of what happened, the history of that work, machine readable, so that you could do analysis of it later. There's also, on the opposite end, in the clear context, having a mission and strategy and vision for the organization, and making sure that that mission is broken down into some very strategic goals. If you're a larger organization, these often turn into key performance indicators, and there's a whole measurement field around how you measure the change that you're trying to achieve as an organization. And then in the lower left, there's you can consider how you train and mentor and work with those teams to make sure that the people doing the work feel confident that they have the right skills. So you can build out a culture of knowledge management by demonstrating and emulating the type of practice within your organization that's going to lead to people not losing information that would be vital. This comes in a lot because I am currently consulting for a government agency. And what I found is that even though they have a lot of expertise, and they often boast about having 140 years of combined development expertise in the review panel, the formats of the documents that they use are completely oblique to a computer that's trying to interpret them. And the structure that they use for mapping out their metrics has very little to do with whether or not the things that they attempted were successful or not. They're counting a lot of things, but they're not counting the things that would be success indicators. And so what we're doing right now is going back and retraining them on how to use a consistent template for how they document things, and getting them to document the things that really matter. That would go into that key enablers quadrant, and probably also around the evolving framework, because we also presented in this consulting group the 4 levels of measurement that you need to have stacked one upon the other in order to get to big things like you have impacted the world, as foundations often like to say. Even though I think that that itself is a whole other discussion that we're not going to have. GlobalGiving has been around for about 20 years now, and along the way we came up with our own framework that we thought was the synthesis and the simplest version of what we think makes partner organizations effective and able to achieve their missions and able to have a bigger impact with less money around the world. And we've often talked about this in our blogs and in our newsletters, but there's this idea of listen, act, learn, and then repeat. And you can see this if you go to globalgiving.org/impact. We explain how this framework fits into all of the things that we try to achieve in the world, including making organizations more sustainable and more connected and more responsive to the people they're trying to help. Now, when you see this, we often don't go the next step of talking about how we inside Global Giving take this idea of listen, act, learn and operationalize it in a workflow. And the one that we use, which was borrowed from the US Army and is popular in many organizations now, is called an after-action review. This is not the only way that you can operationalize how you learn from the work that you're doing on a periodic basis, but this is the one that we chose. And it involves asking some basic questions about the work that you're doing within a project on a regular basis, usually after a campaign. So every year, Global Giving does 4 accelerators to on-ramp new organizations. That ranges from adding 100 organizations, maybe 50, maybe 200 in a month. And preceding that, we get over 1,000 applications that we review. And at the end of that campaign, so 4 times a year, we sit down and the people who are involved go through these questions about what was supposed to happen for that campaign, what actually happened if there were any discrepancies, what should we sustain or include in the next campaign, what worked really well. We can also talk about what we should stop doing because it was an experiment that didn't go so well. And what can we improve about what happened is brainstorming about what we might try to test next. This takes about an hour, and it is always refereed by a third party, so someone on staff who had no direct stake in that campaign, because not everybody at Global Giving works on the accelerator. And we then document the stuff, and I think these days we would probably upload that list of comments into Slack into a channel that is dedicated to the accelerator or to improving accelerators on an ongoing basis. We do this with our business partnerships with like Fortune 500 companies that do employee giving through our site to see whether that stuff is better. We also have done partnerships with other big organizations and foundations, and when those engagements reach a natural stopping point, then we do one of those reviews as well. So that's one example of how we regularly operationalize the learning cycle that we purport that others should be following in their organizations. And the reason that this is so important is because we're in the age, the information age is maturing to the point where we can start to design workflows around measurement. And that measurement can in turn be used to feed into computer analysis so that we can start to see patterns in things without having to have an analyst sit there at the computer and try to do this every time with data. Like 90% of data analysis is finding the data and getting it into the right format for you to be able to run some statistics. By building the workflow out the right way to begin with, that means that you only have to spend the last 10% of interpreting it. So this is a slide from a presentation that I've used with foundations about why measurement is often such a priority for the people with the money who want to give it to organizations that implement things. A lot of them want to talk about impact, and they want to talk about this idea of attribution, which is we gave this organization this amount of money, and then we saw that this thing in the community changed. Therefore, the money we gave this organization must have caused the change in the world that we wanted to see. That's attribution, like claiming that the money you gave is the reason why things changed. And it's a very high bar to prove that. And you're not going to get anywhere about proving attribution or causality if you haven't been collecting enough data as you do the work. So the things that are in the necessary but not sufficient category is having baseline data. When you start doing something in a community, did you measure whether or not that thing you were trying to change, how much of that thing was already there or needed to change? When you finish the intervention, do you collect a big final data set to see whether or not you can do a comparison of before versus after? This is basic experimental design. And in an ongoing analysis way, you could be doing check-ins with communities. You could be doing, if you're doing a service delivery model, like when people come into the doctor's office, you take tests. All of those tests are useful in seeing whether or not there's an ongoing rate of change. And then this is ideally going to feed up into measurements that people call indicators, meaning that multiple organizations are measuring the same thing in the same way, so you can compare them across contexts. And eventually indicators should be useful for saying whether or not big things are changing in communities in a reliable way. A lot of focus is on measurement because people with the money are often asked whether or not they're spending the money wisely. And there's a weird discrepancy because they want to spend money with people who are going to have the most ability to change things in the community, but they also want to work with people who have the best ability to measure whether that change happens. And those are two different groups. Tend to be academic researchers are really good at the measurement side, but they're not so good at the community engagement side. And people who are community leaders tend to not be great at measurement. And it's not, in my mind, a clear way of marrying the two. The best thing that I'm proposing is to think more intentionally about whether or not you need to measure all these things in the first place and ask yourself some of these big questions here. Like one is, are you the major funding source for those grantees in each year over the time frame that you're trying to claim attribution? We know at Global Giving we're not. So we don't ask the attribution question ever because we've already decided that we're not going to be heavily subsidizing any one organization. It's just not going to happen. Peace Corps is another place where they have over 600 community-funded projects every year, but when they talk about it, they never claim attribution. They do claim contribution, and they work with other bigger agencies to figure out how much their volunteers and their resources have contributed to some combined effort in a community, rather than claiming that they are the most important actor there. Did you capture the local context and measure external factors if you're interested in causality? We do a lot of this at Global Giving. We're always trying to get organizations that we partner with to think intentionally about what the community needs are and how do they know that they're listening to that community. And in this course, how can we go the next step of operationalizing that feedback into the workflow of project management in a way that allows you to impress the people with all the money, not just Global Giving. We're pretty easy to impress. But if you want money from like the Gates Foundation, you got to go to the higher bar. And does your data include a significant portion of failed efforts too? This is pretty much never happening in the foundation world, but if you're a data scientist, as I am, you can't find out what works if you haven't also first measured what doesn't work. And you're going to get a lot more data about what doesn't work, but people often throw that out as being unimportant because the funder only wants to know that they were the causal factor or the attributor or the source of change. What we're really interested in, if you want to end poverty, you need to look at something like the Framingham nurses. There's a nurses' health study and the Framingham heart study. These are longitudinal studies that go into a community over decades and just measure what's happening with people's health. And everything that was relevant to treating those problems has first been seen in these longitudinal studies. So Global Giving invested in a storytelling project in East Africa in 2010 that I was able to lead that was a demonstration of what this would look like in the context of ending poverty. And I think we made a lot of progress in showing that that approach could work. If you're interested in understanding how to end poverty, you have to be also interested in understanding community context, and regardless of whether something was success or failure, tracking it all in a consistent way. And the last one here, I'm going to get into some other slides about, are your staff triggering inquiry implicitly as they work? I saw there was one question in here. Oh, just nice. Okay, thanks. So this idea of implicit inquiry is what you might see in this picture here of what a self-driving car would see as it drives through the streets of a busy city. And you can see what this camera on this car is doing is it's using a bunch of different algorithms to identify physical objects in physical space, like fire hydrant, bar, entrance, advertisement. Some of these can be superimposed from the camera on top of maybe a Google Maps and geolocated signal that the car is given. The combination of those can tell you what you're next to and what you should be doing and how far the car in front of you is. All of this might sound like science fiction, but in fact, when you're working within Slack or Asana or Salesforce, you are going through a process which has all of the same features that a self-driving car with a computer is trying to do to navigate the road. The difference is that the car is being programmed to make these decisions, and we're often not even aware that we're making these decisions as we go through our day. So what I want to point out is that as we look at, let me go back a slide. Won't let me. this ask yourself list of things and these necessary but sufficient things. Like when we think about measurement, we also want to think about how our own conversations might be the most valuable piece of the measurement puzzle, because we often say things to each other that are difficult to prove, but are often at the heart of what we think change, successful community change looks like, or successful interventions, or successful service delivery. And in fact, I did a large-scale study on this that I haven't published yet, but if you were to take, and I did this, the indicators from 500 projects funded by a government agency and map out whether or not those tell you which ones were successful and which ones were not, and then in parallel, take the narrative reports from those same 500 projects and run algorithms on the sentiment of every sentence in every report and use them to build up a bell curve of how much success and failure is talked about in those different reports, the narrative is a better data source for predicting outcomes than the indicators are. And this has to do with more lofty things. If you want to get academic, there's something about Shannon information theory, and that words in reports have a lot more information in them than a bunch of numbers in a spreadsheet. It's just that we've often been biased against those words because algorithms didn't exist to extract those words back into useful numbers for comparing across context. But that's now true. You can do that. And what I would say is that the secret to here is that using those types of rich data, narratives and reports, audio interviews, focus group transcripts, videos of people in the field talking about the things in their own words, maybe even videos that the people you're trying to serve are helping to generate themselves when they feel like they have something to say. All of that is being solved through solutions to the interoperability problem. This is a pretty realistic view of just how many different ways there are to transmit purely electronic information from one device to another. And sadly, I think I have used 80% of these myself, other than the diesel gas injector from the gas station at the bottom. Interoperability is a good thing. Interoperability is the ability to save time when going from one information source to another source, presumably where it can be used in a different way, maybe for analysis. What isn't always a good idea is focusing on standards. And so this is purely my opinion, but in the design of good workflows, you need standards, you need interoperability. But we've spent a lot of the time in this course talking about how you can do interoperability. So Slack can talk to Trello, Trello can talk to your email can talk to Slack. All of those things can talk to some other piece of software that you might need. And that's an interoperability problem. The standards part of this is how you then turn the data you're collecting into indicators. And I don't have a clean solution for that, because indicators and measurement on a monitoring and evaluation sense in that level often involve standards, and the standards are not something that you can just create and expect other people to adopt, as this cartoon, which is used widely. Anytime someone talks about standards, this cartoon comes up from XKCD. And that's kind of the heart of the problem with indicators, is that you might think you have the best indicator in the world for something, but unless everybody uses it, it doesn't allow you to do anything other than say that your number exists. In order to say your number is a better score than someone else's, you both have to agree to measure in the same way. And that is there's a psychological barrier to that. People don't want to adopt by default unless there's a real strong incentive. So for the next section, I want to talk a bit more about some examples that use real integrations within Slack to accomplish project management goals. And that might be an illustration of what I mean by interoperability. So before I get into some Slack examples, let me talk about how this would have been presented in a webinar maybe 3 or 4 years ago. And I've actually seen foundations in the US that continue to do capacity building precisely in this sense of saying, okay, you need to measure this stuff. Maybe for us, maybe for someone else. We're going to teach you the best way to do a good, solid measurement strategy so you can have the data you need in order to say that you made a big difference in the organizations that you work at. And so they have prepared something called a data inventory and a checklist. So first thing they want you to do is go through and figure out what information you'll need in order to say that something changed. And this could be attendance records at a school, or it could be people who walk into a hospital and what diseases they get diagnosed with. It could be 50 million things. In the land of Ebola, schools needed to know whether the students were coming in to the classroom each morning, and they had to be screened before school could start so that nobody had any elevated fever, which would have been a sign of Ebola. So this became a very important workflow problem they had to solve. Level of access is, then you ask yourself, are you able to get the data yourself? In the cases of those three, if you run the clinic or the school, you can do that. If you are another agency that needs to know whether or not Ebola is spreading, then the data is available, but it's not accessible. So you would have to partner with each of those schools and set up some workflow for them to be able to transmit that data to you, so you could then run a weekly report on whether or not the rate of Ebola was increasing. And in fact, I worked with an organization that did exactly that. And then there's aspirational data. It would be unlikely for you, while you're collecting the Ebola data from a school or 10 schools, to also ask them to send in data about school lunches and what they were eating for lunch that day. The schools simply wouldn't do that, and so that becomes aspirational. Maybe with a different kind of incentive, you could get them to provide you with that additional data, but they would expect that they would need to be compensated for the extra staff time it takes. And so that's an example of accessible, available, and aspirational levels to a data point that might be important for an indicator such as the rate of curbing the spread of Ebola in Sierra Leone, for example. And then these other considerations, data source, it's very important to have in your workflow a specific plan of who's going to collect the data. It's going to be this teacher at this school at this time of day. Which people need to be involved? Well, for the school's needs, it's just that one teacher and maybe the person who's in the head office that's collating everything. But if it's an outside agency, then it's now a teacher, an intermediary, and an outside agent, 3 people. And if it's going to go up to national statistics, suddenly you're probably up to 5 different people that need to be in a chain. And in the 21st century way of doing this, you might put all 5 people in a Slack channel, and then have that Slack working on people's phones or on their desktop so that people can have a real-time conversation as you cross through from the national office to the regional NGO to the school, one after the other. How often are you going to do it? In this example, I'd say you have to do it every day that there's a school in session, because the school cannot legally start until everyone's been screened. And what are the challenges? Well, your measurements could be off, your devices could be faulty, the internet could be down, and therefore you'll have a delay in getting it. And how important would this be? Well, in this case, in this example, I'd say it's critically important, because the school can't operate if someone has Ebola when it comes to school. So it's super important, super time sensitive, and at the very basic level only involves 2 people, but at the national level involves 5. And now you can see why different people have to go through the data inventory to come up with different answers. The way that I would probably want to do that in 21st century design is, whoops, sorry, I lost my presentation. I would use some of the algorithms that Google and Amazon and IBM and even somewhat Microsoft have been producing. These are very, very cheap. They're not off the shelf, except for the one that I'm showing you, available to people who have no technical background, but they are very useful building blocks for many of the types of integrations that will become direct, commonplace things in a project management world within the next probably 18 months. So the one I want to demonstrate here is Google Cloud Vision. So I'll go over to my web browser. Oops, sorry, I have a lot of windows open right now. So Google Cloud Vision. You can find that. And what this allows you to do is, you can imagine doing this in a batch form. You can click and drag an image from your computer onto this box, and it will tell you everything it knows about that image. So I keep a file full of interesting images here just for this reason. Here's one. What's that one that said bad standard? So here's an image with some words on it, which will make it interesting. And I'm just going to click and drag that one image over there. This is a screenshot I made of a YouTube video. So in essence, this image has never existed on the internet before I clicked and dragged it. So Google has an API that's an automatic algorithm that takes an image and it analyzes all of the pixels in the image, and it can tell you different things about it. So at the very top, it's labeled this image with all of these different tags. It knows it's multimedia. It's got some blue text on it. It knows that there's a font. You can go through and there's sort of numbers assigned as to how important those tags might be in a classifier. Let's see. So the more interesting thing is you can go over to, instead of labels, let's go to documents. And what do you see there? It's highlighted all of the text on the image, and now you've got it in blocks. Standoff, annotations, practical, isn't practical. So all of the words are there. And if you want to export all those words, they provide it in a machine-readable format, which looks like this. All of the metadata is available in one big object. Some other stuff that they might have is it says, is this adult content? No. Is this a meme? No. Has the color makeup? And if it was available on, if you were looking for what this has to do with the internet, it says this is most likely a computer program. Turns out that they are talking about a computer program at a conference called PyData. So I'll do another one just to show you that this can handle a wide variety of content, everything from handwritten notes to social media pictures. So here's one. So this is now a cartoon flow diagram, and it's probably going to tell me where it came from because this is an image from the internet. You go to the web, XKCD is the first one, and that's correct. This is a image from this comic called XKCD. So it was able to figure that out from what's there. It could also tell you a bit more. It's got all of the, this is now handwriting, but it still has all of the words in this image. It's available. Let's see, safe search, spoof. It's a little bit higher on the spoof scale and the racy scale, but it did not say that. I've also uploaded memes, and it will instantly tell you whether it's a meme. So these are all examples of dozens of different algorithms you can run on images, most of which I would say the most useful in your case is if you had a lot of handwriting, you could then take that handwriting and put it into something like this in a batch and get back all the comments from people just from their notebooks. Do you have any questions about that? Whoops, what happened? Oops, let's see. So I'm looking at the chat now. Hello? Sorry, I'm having some trouble with my computer. Okay, I'm back. Okay, so we'll move on. No questions at the moment. So the things that you can do with these new algorithms that are more powerful than the old ones involve, what I demonstrate was image OCR, object character recognition. If you've got words on a page and it's in one of 50 languages, there's probably a way for you to avoid having to type that into a computer automatically. And especially, you shouldn't be using your high-paid staff to do that. There are plenty of places that you could outsource this stuff. Translation, I've tried that on a large scale, and it works. You can also take audio and make text out of it. You can add subtitles to video. You can take the text out of videos. You can send in a whole bunch of words in a document, and it'll pull out the people, the places, the locations, anything that's a unique entity in that document. It can extract that out. You could also automate some of the analysis. This is something I do at another place that I work at, feedbackcommons.org. If people run surveys, then a computer that with algorithms that I wrote will turn out a report that shows you the strengths and the weaknesses of the relationships between that organization and its partners. You can also extract lots of information from documents, including if you've ever read the newspaper and look at the sports section, at least in the US in the last 3 years, the sports section of most newspapers is written entirely by computers now because reporting on what happened in the game last night doesn't require a human. It's such a formulaic way of writing that a computer can write it better and it costs nothing. So extract, meeting, infer, impute, and summarize are the sorts of sentiment and natural language processing things that are becoming better and good enough that you can trust them. Just like it used to be impossible to talk to your computer and have it understand you, now it's possible for computers to read your reports and tell you what they mean. So what this means is that when you think about the old way of doing a workflow and the new way, the old way is Excel documents or Google Docs and thinking a whole lot about this operational stuff, which you still need to do. But a part of every workflow in the future should have a step where that data goes from an analog source to a digital source on a large scale with as much automation as possible. It's possible for you to upload one of these types of content into a Slack channel and have that trigger something in Slack that would just automatically generate the text transcript of it. So the next section I want to show are some specific examples of others out there that have been using Slack and other pieces of technology to do the sorts of project management things that you might be doing. So I've got a first one here, which is how we use Slack and Trello and Team Gantt for project management as a digital agency. I'm going to outlink to that. You should still be able to see my screen. I found most of these on Medium, but what you see here is, so they have clients. Those clients have agreements. Those agreements are something that have a SMART goal. You have to deliver a certain number of things by a certain time, much like a grant would have for a foundation. And so they have their best practices listed out here in this, and I can send this in an email later, but one of them is project-based channels, and we've already talked about that. So every client agreement is a project, and there's a separate channel for each of those, so you can then track the history of what was done for that client in that channel. And then you assign the people who need to be working on that project to that channel. So from day one, the team is assigned. Next, you can also add in the client into that channel so that the client and the team are talking to each other in Slack and eliminate email from that process altogether. I think that that's the right way to do it, but not everyone does. Second, they would attach the agreement to the channel itself. So at the very top of every channel, there's a place that's got a topic, and you can set the topic. You can set that topic to link to a Google Doc where the full deliverables are listed. You could also create a comment in the channel and list out the deliverables, or maybe link to a Trello card with the checklist so people can start checking those things off the list as they're getting done. And in my case, you would also track the hours you spent working for that client on the Trello card that's associated with that channel. So now you have a way for doing a conversation. You've assigned teams, you've assigned roles, you've clearly identified when things are due and what needs to be done by when, and you've provided them with a way to identify that they have completed certain things and not other things as they go. And the client can follow along with this work. Third thing they do is they treat the timeline of the project as the same as the channel's history. Live timeline is project channel description. So what they, in this case, another way that they would look at the timeline is they were using something called a Gantt chart. And a Gantt chart looks like this, where you've got time going in the lateral direction from left to right, and then the different parts of a project going from top to bottom, with the first things at the top of the list and the last things to be done at the bottom of the list. And you get this waterfall chart going down and to the right. This is linked to the channel, and people can refer back to this as they go through the project just to make sure that they are on track against the timeline that was prescribed. I don't use Gantt charts in my work, but I know a lot of projects that I have been on and gone to funders. The funders expect a Gantt chart to show exactly what will be delivered by when, and it's been a useful tool for that. And then the fourth thing they do is they go into the general channel in Slack. This is general across all projects, and they have a weekly plan for the team. So their internal team can see we've got 17 different projects we're working on. For the week of May 9th through the 13th, we're going to work on these 5 projects, and these are the people doing each of those things, and this is what we have to do this week in order to stay on track. And they would pin the notes from that weekly meeting to the general channel itself, so they only have one thing pinned, and the most recent weekly plan is the thing you can find. So throughout the week, you can now refer to that work plan for that week from the general channel. I've started doing this in an organization because I read this blog post and thought that that was a really useful tool. But it takes a lot of discipline. So what I should have done is added a /remind tool to myself to say, okay, it's time to upload your weekly plan from the notes from the Monday morning meeting, so that it always goes up there every week. I don't remember to post those notes to the general channel because I haven't reminded myself. And then the last thing they do is, as they said before, they integrate Trello with Slack, and so they can then track the various parts of projects with checklists and a lot more detail, that each card becomes a task within a project, or each card is one project with a bunch of subtasks within it, and that's a very useful container for this thing. The other one we have here is moving work forward within Slack. Another Medium post. I found this pretty useful. And they were showing some examples like if someone comes into your office and they need to meet with somebody and you have a receptionist, maybe a receptionist is using a physical notepad and there's a lot of stuff that's not optimal about doing that. Instead, you could just have a tablet. The tablet could allow the person to just sign in to a page on Slack, which would automatically generate, in this case, an object that says, look, the receptionist says that there's a meeting here for you, and that would go to the person in Slack, and you've just eliminated the act of having to find the person in the registry, walk down the hall, find that person, or pick up the phone and call them each time and interrupt them. You can just have these things go into a common place. And since the person's probably there for a meeting within the context of a particular project, that invite could be part of the history of that project, so you then have a better timeline of what happened. You're now mapping real physical events onto a single history of the project by automating your sign-in sheet. And they offer some useful tips here on things that would be always part of any workflow if you're trying to map this out. I'm now moving from click and cut and paste kind of templates for workflows where you just take two things and connect them together, to thinking about building a workflow which might require you to do something like hire a developer if you want to build, for example, this reception thing. There's probably a tool out there, but if it's not, you can always have a developer do this. So mapping out a workflow, as I've shown here with this, the kickoff is the event that starts the process. Someone walks into an office. Triage, you assess the impact of the event, assign an owner, and decide on next steps. You might have to decide whether or not this person coming in the office really needs to have a notification go to that person right away, or maybe they're not here for something that's, maybe they're part of a bigger meeting and that you don't need to tell everybody that walks in the office for a big meeting doesn't need to trigger that same event. And then Slack handles the communication step. If there's follow-up tasks, you can see that this little object that gets created in Slack has on my way, running late, let security know, as 3 example ways of following up. Each of those buttons would then trigger a different resolution to this task. And I can send that link out later too. Third, as you build workflows and you want to be more intentional about how pieces fit together, I'm going to show you just the scope, the broad reach of what these 2 third-party tools, IFTTT, which means if this then that, and Zapier allow you to do. So I go back to, here it is, this is IFTTT. I previously logged in, and these are the 5 recipes that I've used in the past. All of them are currently off, but you can see the scope of things that me as one individual might use this for. I don't want to spend time reading Craigslist, which is an advertisement website, but I can just have this program email me whenever a particular Craigslist post matches my search. For example, I wanted a countertop dishwasher for under $50, so I just told it to keep looking for that, and eventually one came up, and I bought it. There's some stuff I was doing with subreddits, and that's a website called Reddit, or getting emails daily from Craigslist, again, or the other 3 or 4. If you go over to services, and these are the top 10, so Slack is in the top 10, Gmail is also in the top 10 because it needs a lot of this. You can also, it'll take a little bit to load, but there's literally thousands of services that are underneath the umbrella of this one website. So now you can filter that by whatever you want. It seems to know I want appliances because of the recipes I already had. But say we were doing something with Salesforce. Well, there's a Salesforce service there. Anything you want, you can probably look it up and see if it's there. So that's the scope of that. And then I found a really useful ebook from Zapier, which I'm going to share the PDF from. So this was called Best Project Management Apps Cheat Sheets. And Zapier is trying to sell you a service, but they wanted to let you know when you want to look at what you're trying to do within your project management workflow, here are the top 50 things that people are using in the world and for what they're using them and what the costs are for each of those if you're planning on building a new workflow. So task lists, you see 5 different options for task lists. Asana is at the top. I think that's probably true because it's the biggest one. It's not free, but it's also a pretty good tool for that. Gantt charts. I showed you an example called Team Gantt, but there are 6 or 7 other tools for managing those Gantt charts. Kanban is a workflow approach that some of you may have heard of, and it involves each of the lists in a Trello board, for example, means a different thing, and you're trying to make sure that nothing piles up in the different stages in a process, because that means there's a bottleneck. And so Kanban is really good at seeing a workflow with lots of people and lots of actors and knowing which parts are the slowest parts that need some help. I use Scrum in all of my work, so there's 5 actions there for Scrum. I don't use any of those, I just use Trello, but GlobalGiving does use Jira, which is the second one here. And what it allows GlobalGiving, building a website, to do is there have been over 50,000 changes to the code since it launched in 2003. And you can then decide every month what are the important things to work on, what tasks fall under those changes we have to make. And then as you make each change, you can do very clear tracking of each of the pieces of the site that are changing and why and what went wrong if something has to be reverted. Jira is a way of monitoring all of the changes to a giant piece of code and correlating that with the different people on the team that are doing things to it. Communication, there's some things here. I know from our annual survey at GlobalGiving that Basecamp is one of them that people use. And it's nice to be able to figure out which teams are working within an organization on what using one of these apps. If you're managing relationships with clients, then you'll see these things here. There's a lot of those. That might be analogous to project management for writing reports to funders type of uses, although there's specific software out there like Razor's Edge just for managing grants and managing reporting. Often the funders have that software and you're reporting into it. And then there's some that are more customizable. I've used Podio, but we stopped. We decided that Podio was redundant with Slack, so we don't use that anymore. So I can send this to you in the follow-up email because I think this cheat sheet, along with the features of the various tools, might be helpful as you decide what you're trying to build within your organization. So I'd like to stop here and open it up and actually turn on some audio for the people that are in this room. Does anyone have questions? And would anyone like to be, I'm just going to turn on audio for all 12 of you because I feel like I've been talking too long. Let's see. Audio options. No, that's me. Does anyone have questions about any of the stuff that I've talked about so far? It's good up to now. Okay, well, I guess maybe I can just ask you for some comments about, you can respond in comments, but based on what you've seen in the last 3 weeks, do you think that your organization is likely to change some of its workflows to adopt some of these new practices? Michelle said, I don't think we have one question, but probably millions of them to implement all of that. Yeah, and in fact, that's why organizations with probably 20 staff have one person whose full-time job is to think about the things I've talked about here. It could be a full-time job if you want to constantly refine those things. And I forgot to put this in the presentation, but there's a nice XKCD comic showing, it's a trade-off chart showing how much time should you spend trying to improve your workflow versus how much time you're likely to save, and then somewhere in between is where it decides for you whether or not you should do that or not. So I don't think that any of us are going to do all of the changes, but if you're an advocacy organization or do a lot of direct grant reporting and maybe you have a staff of 3 or 4 people, this is an opportunity to think about whether one of those people could be there to improve the efficiency of the other 3. So based on what you've seen in the last 3 weeks, maybe a yes or no, do you think you're likely to change the workflow that you currently have within your organization? Arsalan says, yes, these softwares are pretty helpful. We need to train our staff accordingly to implement and systematically use them in order to do better project management. And I agree, there's a lot of training. I hope that these webinars, if you share them again, might be useful as a training tool for them. If not, please email me. And maybe if you have very specific ideas, we can then redo this series later on, tackling much more granular things for the people. This itself was a diversion from GlobalGiving's typical webinars, because in the last 10 years that I've been there, almost all of them have been around the fundraising person or the admin person. And we never talk to the project management people or the field staff, and we would like to. We'd like to figure out how we can be useful for everyone within an organization. So Greg, can I unmute you and you can say a little bit more about what you mean by orientation and adoption are likely to be the challenge? I don't know if your microphone works, but you are available, Greg. And if you do find that you have more questions about specifics, that's why I've offered a free consult to every organization that signed up for this. I will have on the next slide a link to a page where you can just pick an hour of my time and I'll meet you there if it's during normal GlobalGiving working hours of 9 to 5, Monday through Friday, and I'm not already in a meeting. The app will make sure that I'm not already in another meeting. Greg, are you ready? Arslan, did you want to say anything? I can unmute you too. Okay, well, I guess Greg can't get his microphone to work, but oops. Arslan, are you there? Okay, well, I guess I'll move on to wrap up since I don't see any other questions here. Let's see. Oops, that was the end of it, huh? So I don't have the link here, but I'm going to send out a feedback survey. It will only have probably at most 5 questions. We want to know whether or not this session was helpful and whether or not, in which ways do you think it was helpful to your organization? In which ways could it be improved? And I also sent out these slides and some of the links that I shared to those blog posts because I think that they're useful and practical. Are there any last comments before we close this session? All right, well, thank you everybody for coming. And I'm going to go ahead and stop recording now. Michelle has a last minute question here. I would like to know if GlobalGiving could send you to us on site. Well, Michelle, it depends on where you are in the world. I live in Durham, North Carolina. I get up to Washington, D.C. every other month or so. I don't tend to go to South Africa very often. I did go to South Africa in March, but unfortunately I didn't know that you needed to meet with me then. So probably it would be more likely that one of our many field travelers could come in person and use this as a template for doing some of this, because I'm certainly not the only person that can help you on this. I'm just trying to get you started in thinking about the potential of using technology differently for workflows and project management. All right, well, thank you all, and I will close this now. If you need to reach me again, you know how to reach me over email, and you'll get a follow-up from me very soon in email.